Welcome to this week's tech series. Today we're going to be talking about manufacturing transformation. Specifically, we're going to be talking about demand and inventory forecasting and how we can use technology to be able to improve that area of most businesses. So today, my name is Nathan Lesnowski. I'm Concurrency's Chief Technology Officer. I'll be your host. And then with me is a special guest. This is Swami Venkatesh. Swami is a solutions architect, data scientist with Concurrency. He has been with us throughout many data science projects, leading engagements, and I'm really happy to have him here on the conversation today. Welcome, Swami.
Thanks so much, Nathan. Happy to be on this. Looking forward to the
Awesome.
discussion.
Awesome. Thanks, Swami. All right, so what are we going to talk about? Today we are going to talk about some manufacturing scenarios. We'll talk specifically about one of those manufacturing scenarios, which is demand inventory forecasting and improving the way we think about that part of our business. And we'll be driving into what the positive gains are associated with that particular part of transformation. Also, I want to make sure you're aware of some upcoming webinars. We have some coming up. Well, first on June 3rd, we're going to talk about securing your enterprise with Microsoft Security Solutions. This is particularly important. It's been important, and the pipeline disaster has even highlighted further how important it is to be thinking about security within our organizations. So do not miss that. If you know someone in the security organization within your business, make sure they're aware of that webinar. Also on June 17th, we're going to be talking about the top 10 lessons learned from countless cloud migrations. We are totally at the top of that bell curve right now, where companies are migrating from their on-premise environments to the cloud, exiting their on-premise data centers. That conversation is one that you do not want to miss if you are in the data center or cloud space. All right, so as we get into this subject today, I want to break down what we're thinking about in technology into two sectors: above the line and below the line. So below the line is where we're thinking about things like IT operations, driving efficiency with cloud transformation, secure modern workplace, and making that a secure, effective commodity within our business. That is a really important part of what technology delivers within an organization. What we're focusing on today is above the line services, specifically around operational savings driven from data and AI services. And this is where our key goal is to take the existing operations of the business and drive operational savings by doing more with the same data, and maybe even enhancing the data when we discover that we don't have everything that we need. So when we think about transformation above the line, areas that add revenue or drive operational savings, what we're seeing is that there's different types of themes that exist in many of the businesses. The one we're going to be spending most of the time on today is talking about automating the supply chain of an organization, about taking the supply chain from I know I need something for my customer and bringing that supply chain awareness up to allow us to be able to drive efficiencies. And we'll talk a little bit about practical examples of where that efficiency has been drawn and what that revenue impact or operational savings impact has been. Supporting that story is other types of transformation that might be happening within a business, such as changing the way you're quoting your customers or driving predictive maintenance within the supply chain. Some of our customers, for example, they can't produce product fast enough right now. So when they think about the ideas of producing product fast enough, they need to know their supply chain. They need to think about how they're quoting, and then ultimately they need to keep the supply chain functioning in a way that allows it to deliver for their customers. So things like predictive maintenance and smart warehouse come into play, and then ultimately driving smart products that are being delivered to customers, customer insights around what's sold, these big stories around this is what I'm selling, this is what they're buying, and then even tactical items like quality management and cycle counting. So there's so many different areas of transformation where there's opportunity. This is just one of them, and it's one of them where we're seeing a high density. So when we talk about these inside of many of our customers, this automation of the supply chain ends up being the one that has the most impact in the shortest period of time for many of our organizations we're working with. So what we're going to do today is dive into this idea around supply chain. How do we align inventory with demand and sell? How do we solve this problem or improve this outcome associated with different stages of the improvement of supply chain? And Swami is going to help us with breaking down the different elements of this. So Swami, why don't you start by just helping us to understand the key scenarios associated with supply chain optimization and where that return on investment has tended to be with some of those stories.
Sure. When you look at, let's say we take a manufacturing unit, right? I mean, if you're manufacturing and selling a product, you got to start with the supply chain with what the raw materials are for that producing that particular product, right? Those raw materials, you'll be procuring it from different places. So there is a supply forecast associated with that, right? And then there's a demand forecast. When you have your product and you sell it out to your clients, at what rate would those clients be buying these products? So that's your demand forecast, right? You have the supply and demand forecast kind of, and in between this, like let's say the other idea here is when you talk about inventory optimization, when you produce a certain product, you want to make sure that it doesn't stay on your shelves for too long. You need to push it out as much because the minute you start holding on to it, then there are inventory costs associated with it. Say,
Mm-hmm.
suppose you store it in a warehouse, right? Then you have got issues. How big should your warehouse be? How much should you hold items on stock so that you can at least kind of meet your clients' demands on time? So those are the different parts that we kind of look into and talk about. But beyond all of this, there's also this idea of data. Where does this data come from? Like supply data, does that exist with you? Do you have a very good hold of what the supply looks like? Or is it with your suppliers? In which case, how do you get at that data? How do you understand with what frequency do they work? How do you get stuff? Demand data you would have on your own. You know how your customers are, when your customers are asking you for it, that data exists. But even within this data, there are little nuances, right, that exist that we really need to understand. And maybe that these are some things that machine learning can actually leverage. So I guess the first point that when given the complexity of supply chain optimization, where we usually start off with in our engagement with our client, is to first ask, what is the data that you have? Like, let's start talking about that. Do you have the supply data? Do you have the demand data? What kind of inventory data do you have? And we can even go into details such as, hey, what's the size of the product that you have? So if you're going to store it in a warehouse, like, would we then optimize how many of that product can you put in a warehouse at a given point of time, given space limitations? We could even go up to that extent and give you a very clear aspect of that. But again, so coming back to the first point, like, what amount of data do you have? How do you store this data, right? And how can we access that data? Most of the clients that we talk to also kind of talk about cloud transformation around the same time as they're talking about coming up with these ML engagements. So we try and give them an idea as to what kind of a cloud architecture can we create within the Azure environment that would help them. We help them migrate the data, identify the data that needs to be migrated, migrate that data, and then start going into data transformations and analysis. And one of the best things with Azure is right now with Azure ML, right, and the capabilities coming up in that space, there's a whole lot you could do. You could create the models, you could train the models, you could test the models there, and you could even deploy the models. So an end-to-end capability for creating to deploying models exists within just Azure ML, right? So again, it's a broad process that takes care of one, the data, trying to understand what the ask is, what is the pain point for the client, starting from there, and then jumping into details as to how we can model that process, what other data sets that we can add to it to make sure we get at a high accuracy, right? And then finally deploying that out, creating reproducible, because one thing that I have to mention here is, as far as forecasting is concerned, forecasting is not a one-time trained and done kind of deal, right? You have to keep training with newer data at probably regular intervals so that you catch all these trends that you see in the data. You have short-term trends, you have long-term trends. You need to capitalize on all those to get to a really robust model. So given that, you need to keep training this model. And that's why I keep talking about an architecture on the cloud that supports this, right? You don't want to spend too much time and too much of energy and manpower on simply rerunning these trainings and testings each and every time. So you want to automate it to a large extent as possible. And if there are places where, say, the training didn't go so well and you've kind of put the blockers, etc., that you have notifications sent to you. So the data scientist, in-house data scientist can then jump in at that stage and say, hey, there was a problem. I need to take a look at what's happening there. If there are no problems, then you want a seamless deployment of that model, and you want insights from that model going in at whichever interval that you want done, monthly interval, quarterly interval, so on and so forth.
Got it. Can you let's back up for just 1 second and talk a little bit about the end in mind. When a company starts to pursue supply chain optimization, what are the kinds of gains that you typically see from that? What outcomes should they be targeting, and how do they compare those outcomes against their current state?
Let's start off with demand forecasting. Let's take a very simple case, right? I mean, if they have a time series forecast, if say the current forecasts are hitting at about 60, 70% accuracy for you, if you have a time series forecast. And what we have seen from our engagements is that we can kind of push that up from say 70 to 80, 85, 90%. So somewhere between 15 to 20% bump, that gives them a huge savings in the end. Like for the typical case that I was talking about, if you can align your demand to the production rates, then you get less time holding that inventory. And if you hold your inventory less, the savings are enormous. This translates into the millions in some cases, because if you don't have to hold it and you can immediately ship it out, right? There are such interesting transformations that you can do. I mean, for one of our client cases, what actually happened was by freeing up inventory holding in their own warehouses, they could actually rent out their warehouse space to other people, as a result of which they actually made money out of streamlining this process. So not only are you talking about dollar gains as far as not holding the inventory in your own warehouses, you're actually talking about now new sources or new streams of income by simply renting out that extra space that you have.
Hmm.
So, I mean, these are really interesting ways you can think about by a very simple thing. You just improved your demand forecast by about 20%. That gave you enormous gains at the end of it. And that's
That's
just
a
one
great,
example.
great breakdown, especially as the tension, as we go to our next slide, is this tension between being just in time
Mhm.
and having all this inventory on hand to be able to
Correct.
deliver on high service levels and trying
Mhm.
to navigate that space between those spots. Can you help us break down this by pieces? Maybe starting with the upper left-hand corner here and kind of going through this on a piece-by-piece basis in terms of
Sure.
where we
Yeah.
look for how we go about solving this.
Sure. So the first place where we usually start is that demand forecast, right? I mean, so let's give a different examples. Now, let's say suppose you've got different production units in different locations, and each production unit has their own product list that they produce, right? So you've got a bunch of SKUs that they produce on location, and each of these products have different ways in which they are burnt out given that particular location where they're produced, right? So you could have, let's say in the Northeast, you could possibly have a certain product X that's being, used up at a much more faster rate than, let's say, the central US, right? In which case you would want to produce more of it in the Northeast than you do in the central US, right? That kind of a thing. So trying to understand, so you want to create these forecasts for per location and per item that you're looking at, right? Because that is when you really get to make critical decisions. Now, you have to understand it from an ML point of view. Like, let's say if you have something like one of our clients has 70,000 SKUs, right, at about 3, 4 different locations spread all over the US. You're looking at multiple combinations and multiple different models that you have to build at the same time, and everything has to hit the right accuracy for you to kind of give uh, results that you can actually rely on, reliant results. So that's why a lot of thought and effort goes into getting that demand forecast up and ready. So in a very simple sense, it's only a time series predictor, right? A time series forecasting. You have a certain amount of, for a certain product in a certain location, this is the rate at which people use on, say, a monthly scale, or sometimes some of these fast selling products go on a daily scale. So we can actually get our time series prediction down to a daily scale, a weekly scale, a monthly scale. And for items that are slow selling, right, we jump up to probably a quarterly scale at that stage. So that's the other flexibility that we can get in. So different products, different combinations, we can work out to what scale we have continuous data, right? And that's just the data itself. Now, within this data, you get ideas of seasonality. There could be times in a year that product sells more, right? It could be right around fall that you see an increase. And so we try to understand what the seasonality is and factor that seasonality into our forecast, right? In addition to this, there are some times in which you might have decided to give a certain promotion associated with a product, right? Now, that does result in an increase in the demand for that particular product, right? Some people have asked us the question, could we then factor that into our demand forecasting? Absolutely, we can, right? Give us that data, give us an idea as to what time period you had that promotion running, and we can factor that in for you. So the next time you decide to put in that promotion and you feed it ahead of time to the model is smart enough to process that, look into history and say, hey, this happened in the past, so I predict that this is going to happen to a certain extent in the future, right?
Mhm.
And this is from within your own data, right? There are data sets where we try and identify what are leading predictors of data that could come up. Like, does that exist within your data itself, right? That's kind of where we go up to the external factors. Sometimes that data doesn't exist within your own data set, so which is when we start jumping to try and see other macroeconomic factors that kind of determine or kind of tell us that similar trend existed. Now that's a lot of work. It's kind of trying to identify which external factor most aligns with your data, right? But once we hit at that, it's an added, what we call an added regressor to the time series model. If we add that in, it helps you predict that even better. So the next time, let's say for uh, if you were manufacturing a certain asset that required metals, and I'm looking at metal future prices, and the future prices kind of tell me, if I add that in as a lag, so 6 months down the line, if I can predict that out, and that prediction is added to the forecast for today, I might be able to predict what happens next month much better than what I was doing with just your own historical data, right? And these are the added add-ins that we kind of put in to push the accuracy forecast higher and higher, try and get to the 90% level. And as I said, which even a few percentage point increase in accuracy can translate to millions in dollars, like in dollars for savings. So
Mhm.
that's one way to look at it.
Ultimately, you're trying to inform the inventory need, but you can't do that without understanding demand.
Correct. So if we kind of move forward, like from a demand forecast, we jump on, there are, like, as you very rightly said, we are trying to estimate the inventory need at this stage. There are a few other things that we can add in if you go down the marketing mix model, trying to understand. I mean, something as simple as, let's say, what does the client always order? So when you take a grocery store, you won't always order you always order things together with one another. So let's say I order for milk, I probably would add eggs alongside. And so I can understand the nuance of a particular customer by seeing what he orders together, right? So when he orders milk, then I'm going to say, hey, whenever this guy orders milk, he always puts eggs together, or even try to understand the bulk in general, right? From all of your clients, let's say every time somebody asks for milk, they also will ask for eggs. So I need to make sure both eggs and milk needs to be stocked at a certain location at all times, right? Given the demand of milk, I can say exactly how many eggs they'd be ordering as well. So that's kind of marketing mix. And also the idea of advertisements was also promotion kind of covered at the same time. So it's all a mix of that. We could add that in, again, forecasted by region, season, number of clicks on an ad, different ways. If you have online website data into what kind of products people were looking at, then that's another very good leading indicator of what we can use to shore up our demand forecast. But again, ultimately, what we want to get to is that correct inventory level, maintaining the right inventory. So you're hitting, let's say, if you're about 96, 97%, you're meeting the demand for about 96, 97%. You're never going to hit 100%. I mean, holding that level of inventory is not really smart from a savings perspective. What you want to see is if you can manage to hit about 96% of your client expectation, then you usually end up managing the inventory that way.
Mhm.
Another main thing that you need to understand as far as managing the demand is also uh, how to optimize the storage across DCs. This is another thing that we discussed, touched upon in the very beginning of our webinar. What's the amount of space that it takes, right? If 96% of meeting customers' demand meant I have to hold on to, I don't know, tens of thousands of a certain product in inventory, right? And I'm sure that I'll sell it within a week, let's say. But then it still might not be the best way to think about it. But then if I could link that up with the right production rate, right? Make sure that I have that rolling into the inventory and demand rolling out of the inventory at the same time. I can possibly hold on to 1,000 at a given point of time, but then there's going to be no like I still am going to meet my clients' demands and not fail on them. There are some interesting ML products that we have designed in the past around this as well, around inventory optimization, around space optimization. So these are optimizers that we can get to. So that's another interesting bit. And again, trying to estimate what the manufacturing load is and even future component needs. And when we go to the right-hand corner, now, all this is within demand and looking at it from one end. But what about the supply? What about the raw materials for that demand that come in? We've got to keep an eye on that as well, right? You got to make sure that there are no, if there are issues in the supply coming in, then you're definitely not going to meet up the demand as well. So you need to be cognizant of that and make sure that we get that in to place. So it's a delicate game. It's multiple models all playing, and we try to get them all to play together in one environment so that what you see is a seamless flow all the way from supply to demand and to people meeting the demand at that stage. So
You know what's so interesting to me when I see this broken out into pieces is each one of these steps has its own level of accuracy in the
mhm,
extent to which it's predicted.
exactly.
And it also highlights how difficult it would be for an individual to make these decisions through intuition alone,
Correct.
and how low that accuracy must be when it's all aggregated together.
Mhm. Imagine this. I mean, when you're feeding data to an ML model, right? There are so many streams, as you very rightly said. I mean, imagine it's like you're breaking it down to a certain location, a certain product, right? Can one person or a group can you really look at each and every trend, micro trend that takes place? It's going to be very difficult, right? I'm not saying it's impossible, but it's difficult. And so bringing ML into the mix and trying to get it to understand these trends, be it short term, long term, whichever way it is an added factor. And one of the other things that I've always felt interacting with clients is that their own subject matter expertise is crucial for us, right? So it's
Mhm.
like the entire supply chain team, when we talk to them and kind of understand, they have a very, very good insight into what are these external factors sometimes that are important for us to bring it in. And in turn, that expertise, when we kind of package it into our ML model, is super useful to them in the long run because then they are seeing the output of that. They're seeing the forecast improving dramatically and translating into gains for them in dollar terms as well as far as the process is concerned. So it's a win-win for everyone. So I think it's really important. What we really value is how we work as a team. Like when we as consultants go into our clients and then the clients bring in their subject matter experts who actually help us hone in on these micro trends, etc., which they have an idea about, but instead of them looking into those micro trends every time they recreate the model, we have the ML model looking into it, ML model like feeding it into its networks and spewing out the prediction that you want to see.
Exactly. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, what this might show us from a customer buying pattern standpoint. If you look at it like turn it outward, turn it into like
Hmm.
the potential of this being used for like who do I go sell to? Who do I put more energy
Correct.
into? This
Correct.
is something we've produced for a customer.
Yeah, and this is a very interesting bit. I mean, what the demand forecasting did was it tells you exactly what is expected out of a certain customer at a given point of time. So we extended that analysis into a dashboard like this, right? So if at a given point of time, a certain customer's uh, uh, order doesn't match up with what you have predicted for them, that'll come up as a red block right here, right? And the intensity of red tells you by what extent it is off. Now you can go in, click on the customer, check and see. They'll say, hey, we expected them to put in an order for, let's say, 1,000 pieces, but they have just put in 500. Or let's say they've put in two. Like that's the level of things. So 500 would probably get you a lighter shade of red, and a more brighter shade of red would be when you have a much larger deficit. But the point is this, that when you have this dashboard in front of you every single day, then you know exactly which customer is having an issue. You can then reach out to that customer. You can either have sales or your marketing team reach out and say, hey, what's the reason that there's that deficit, right? Was it an order that's not being placed correctly, that you did not estimate it, but hey, but we estimated that you need this much. So is there a place where we can meet, right? So this kind of live output of the data kind of helps you, and sometimes it could just be that, hey, the person who was placing the order had changed and they didn't have the right data, so they had placed a wrong order. They're going to be really thankful to you to have pointed that out and say, hey, you're right, I need 1,000. So go ahead, let's change that order, right? So having that set up correctly is going to be really, really useful. And so this is just an offshoot of our demand forecasting
Exactly. You
ability.
could think about it like, let's say you're a food distributor and your restaurant that you're working with was typically buys, 100 packs of eggs and they only bought
Mhm.
one. And you say, hey, did you know that you only bought 1 pack of eggs? They're like, whoa, that's wrong. We need
Yeah, exactly.
this. Otherwise, we can't
Uh-huh.
serve our customers.
Correct.
Yeah.
And it's like even user error at this stage, right? I mean, what if they were
hmm
meant to put in 100 and instead they just forgot a zero instead, right? So what if they made it 10? So it's things like these that you can help improve your own process as well as make life really easy for your customers as well, because you're reactive. You have addressed a problem before it became a big problem for them. So
Awesome. Well, we've got about 3 minutes left. So let's talk just very briefly. You hit this on the beginning. I want to make sure you hit it at the end here.
mhm.
What are some of the inputs that we need to be thinking about as we go down this journey?
Yeah, and as far as the inputs, again, things like historical sales data, right? We usually ask for about 3 to 5 years, but again, given the trends, we could even do with less. I mean, that's not a problem. But the more history we are given, the more robust is our like the identity or identification of these trends. If you have geographic data on customers and the different distribution centers, that will be an added plus. We spoke about the if there are other industries, your competitors maybe, if you have insight into their data, and that kind of helps you supplement your data set, and that's another way to look at it. You've got similar products in within your company that kind of the trends kind of match what we are trying to do. That would be another way to look at it. And external economic multipliers, right? There's a whole lot of data that we get from government sites as well. So that's another, again, having an intuition as to what the trends are and what kind of industries match with your trends would be a good starting point for us to kind of hone in on that exact data set. But those are the classic inputs. And what we do, like bring out outputs is, as we said, like demand forecast for large buyers, small buyers, within a product group, in a certain distribution center. Like we could go up to that level of granularity, and we could go into a daily cadence, a weekly cadence, a monthly, quarterly, yearly, whichever way you want to look at it. We could easily hit all of those. And the side products, the customer anomaly detection that we spoke about is an awesome side product that we could get out of just creating the demand. And this is just a dashboard that we get out of. the demand forecast.
Awesome. All right. With our one thing I want to call out here is this tends to be something that you can get output relatively quickly. It's just an example. This is not necessarily what any particular companies would look like. But what we find is usually over a 4 or 5 week process, you can get a good production pilot in place to start understanding this problem and get to a level of certainty of your ability to address it and drive that forward into an operationalized state over a course of a relatively short period of time, such as
Correct.
10 to 15 weeks.
Mhm. That's what we've seen in some, and again, it all starts with the data. If you have that initial data and we have the right POC marked out for you, you can actually see a lot of advantage even at the end of the POC. Operationalizing it gives you, it's a cherry on top of the cake. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, Swami, man, we could have probably spent a whole half day talking about this, especially that data topic. Wow, the
Exactly.
inputs. I mean that comes up so often. So thank you so much for diving into this, especially breaking it down into its pieces. We would love to take a next step with every company that is thinking about this challenge. We would love to meet one-on-one. What we would do in that one-on-one session is we talk about your specific challenge. We would look for how we can address that particular challenge, and then we drive that into a couple-hour workshop to be able to understand it more specifically and get to a level of certainty that we can address it. What we're talking about here is applying off-the-shelf capabilities to your problem. This is not a solution that's a software as a service solution. We're talking about applying data science capabilities to a challenge that you have within your business, but accelerating it so we can get to outcome faster. Great opportunity for us to make that change and great opportunity for us to achieve real operational improvements within your business. So let's meet virtually one-on-one to make that happen. Also, again, don't forget about our upcoming webinars, June 3rd on security and June 17th on cloud migration. Both are really important topics right now. And then finally, don't forget to visit our concurrency.com. Lots of great blogs on this topic, videos on this topic, old webinars that address a lot of these same themes, and lots of other assets for you. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks for joining us as we talked about demand inventory forecasting. And thank you especially to Swami for all the detail.
Thank you. Have a nice day.